Can I go, Tope? Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor Benga Falabi, a doctoral student with Holt International Business School, and I will be taking you through this practicum, which is in partial fulfillment of my doctorate of business administration degree. What this presentation speaks to is basically looking at how startups, which constitute quite a number of us who are either managing businesses or leading business as founders, co-founders, C-suite executives, is what are the barriers that affects the scale up of firms. Another word you can use to determine scale up is ability to grow. Why do organizations struggle to grow in this part of the world compared to other parts of the world? Bearing in mind that when you look at our climb and other climbs, it's believed and perceived that startups are the one that should be driving the engine room of growth. The question is, what are the challenges in this part of the world, and why are we not going the same way? So I'll be talking about institutional intermediaries because we think that it's around the structure. When you look at what people say, even when I know that, you find that it's around what are the institutions that support ability of companies to grow. And I said, why scaling up is easier said than done. And that's the topic where we're looking at institutional intermediaries and why scaling in African setup is usually easier said than done. The assumption is everybody wants to be a unicorn, but easier said than done. And I'll take us from introduction to research issues. Then I'll show you the hypothesis analysis, what are the findings and what are the implications. So that, for every one of us, as we look at our businesses, or we advise other businesses, we're able to see what are the contextual issues and how do we manage them. So again, like I said, African business environment is characterized with severe resource constraints and initial constraints raising from access to capital. So I know in some other climes, once you have a good idea, it's easy for you to get funding. You walk into a place with 5%, you work out and all that. But we see that in Africa, it's totally different. And huge institutional constraints. If you virtually anything you need from institutions, which are formal institutions, from government and all that, is a big deal. And when we talk about institutions, we're talking about regulatory institutions, we're talking about supportive banks, we're talking about talent institutions. In developed environments where you're out of work, one of the issues is that you register that you're out of work, and people are already calling you based on the work, which is, employment, organizational services. These are things that I find in other clients that guarantees that even startups, even when you need a talent pool, it's a lot easier to get those things done. But we find that these deficits, including infrastructure, a lot of people are building after you build, like this morning that we saw that I assume that a lot of Okadas ended up in the canal because there's no infrastructure for drainage and all that. Even physical infrastructure that you need for startups, you are thinking, but how do you get them done is a challenge. So despite the proliferation of startups in Africa, which again, if we have Tope who leads the startup, Lagos startup, every day we're having new startups come up. But despite that, we're not seeing their impact. Poverty is rising. 67% of Nigerians are still multidimensionally poor. And yet companies are opening every day, which means that something is wrong. So this context is what gave birth to the concept of institutional intermediaries as a substitute that people can use to grow their businesses if governments do not give us the right institution that can support the growth. So what is a scale up, or what do we mean when the company is scaling up or growing? So globally, it is determined that for you to say a company is growing or scaling up, it should be able to grow in 3 parameters. You should be able to grow 20% in your number of employees. So if you got 100 employees, we expect by 2025, you should have 120 employees. By 2026, you should have another 20% of that, which is another 48%, 48 employees added to it. And another, by 2027, another 20% added to that number. So again, I'm not sure this is what we see, and that's what it means for organizations to grow, not only in your employees, but also in your turnover, and of course, the growth of also your full-time employees. So that's it. But what are the issues? One prominent constraints that startups face in emerging markets, and here we're looking so much around the Nigerian setup, which many of you operate, is that we think that people struggle around issues around talent to help you build your startups. People struggle around product markets. I have built a startup. How can I get it to the right product place, so that people can patronize? There are many good products that are dying every day. People struggle around the capital market where I need access to funding to be able to scale. The devaluation and all that, even the infrastructure to build is an issue. People struggle with information that I need. The biggest challenge you have is that even the information that helps you know how to scale, and of course regulatory. I'm sure Mr. Val that runs a fintech can attest to how frustrated he is around for regulatory requirements, for his agents, for things like that. Those are the issues people deal with, which you don't find in other climes. From severe regulatory issues, KYC issues, and again, under regulatory is also the cyber risk and fraud issues that you are dealing with, which you do not find in other climes. Here, you find out that some things go, you take 1 year, and then they say you can't find another. So those are the issues. So this presentation aims to offer valuable insight into the key determinants influencing scale-up activities within this sector. So what did we do? We did a quantitative research methodology, which is quantitative. We didn't ask people questions. We sent out survey. We got 400 respondents. We did a structured questionnaire using validated scale. We distributed to online platforms using our ecosystem, people that are using in Startup Lagos, people that have come to co-innovation. We use them, startups, platform, and incubators. That's where we got information from. And then we ran two kind of analysis. We do analytics using the SPSS, and we use structural equation modeling using Amos and SEM. And then I'll talk about discussion and the implication, okay? So what's the first thing we're trying to find out? Do institutional intermediaries, do they support startups? And what example of them, if I talk in the finance space, for example, credit rating bureaus. If I know that somebody borrows money from this fintech and doesn't pay, and there's a credit bureau that allows me to know that don't borrow this money in PalmPay, it's owing Kuda. Don't borrow this person in Flex Money. So if we have those kind of institutional surveys structure, or if there's an environment where I can say I want a product manager that knows how to write code bases in a dot language, and I can get a CV in few minutes that tells me their capabilities, their quality, and what they've done, which is coming about talent intermediaries, or I even have good incubation that is helping me know where I can get venture startups and guarantee me for startup funding. Will those kind of institutional intermediaries, will they allow startups to do better, or it doesn't change anything? The other part is that entrepreneurial brokerage, which is the act of improvising, we think is relevant as a mechanism. Because again, we see that so many startups don't know how to improvise, they don't know how to bootstrap. They raise a lot of money to fund their lifestyle, and a lot of people live over investors' money. Just thinking about investor. We don't want to think. If people practice entrepreneurial bricolage is the act of making do, managing. When you first start, how do you bootstrap and use what you have at hand? If people use that, does it even allow them to be able to use other ways to, instead of you employing people, freelancing and all that, if you use those ideas, does it allow you to scale up? And then finally, we want to see, is there a difference? People that have raised money and people that have not raised money, is there a difference in how they scale up? Which is the final one, moderation, where we're saying the entrepreneurial, we're looking at the final one to talk about the moderation that people who have raised funds versus those who have not raised funds, okay? And so when we send this survey out, the result, 78% of the participants were male, which shows that there's a dominant of male in the tech ecosystem. And this underrepresentation, 22% of female in the ecosystem, shows that there's a disparity. Question is, are we going to get more significant scale up or we get more females in it? We also find out that people that raise money, 77% of people that raised money actually are raising a lot of, sometimes people have raised money. But many of the funds that they raised were actually from family and friends. And very few people raise money from informal areas. What that tells you is that many of the startups are essential entrepreneurs, which is they are living from hand for mouth. They've not structured themselves. If all the money you've raised.
So please, if it's there, and if it's not on the slide, you could actually respond to that.
Yeah, so we do believe that
Publication, this generally a 75-25% representation of male gender to female gender actually affects not only status but STEM as a whole. STEM generally talks about science oriented courses, which talks about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we do think there's a general global awareness and sensitization to have more females embrace STEM, which ultimately takes them to be able to work in a startup. Because what's the difference between a startup and the general SME? Startups are the ones that have high potential for growth, but also leverage technology to be able to scale their business. That's what makes a startup. Unlike a typical SME who's doing a traditional business, has moderate growth, but not employing a lot of technology. So we do think that there's a general underrepresentation supported by many other researches apart from Disrupt Africa. And when we did check this in our ecosystem, we saw that this also is in line. And we do think that having more females to come in, because there's a general perception also that inclusivity helps every organization. We also think with more female founders, because there are quite a number of funds that are dedicated to female and supporting inclusivity, it helps drive participation. And that's why we think that there needs to be deliberate programs that support female entrepreneurs, dedicated incubators, dedicated funding to give them a fair chance. Because also research from scholars tells you that we have more females who end up being necessity entrepreneurs who don't have the ambition for scale up. So if we're able to get more of them into it, it generally improves the socio-economic well-being of the populace, where that, it's about wealth redistribution and driving inclusivity. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So
Hold on the mic.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for
Yeah.
the presentation.
Thank you.
So when you were discussing when you're talking about your hypothesis, you said you're going to discuss the difference, if there was a difference in scale of
Yes.
between those who raised and those who haven't. I don't know if you did like a study or
Yeah.
I didn't see it.
Okay, I'll
I don't know
explain.
if you could explain better.
Okay. Those who raised and if they were able to scale,
Yes.
and those who did not raise,
Yes,
if they were able to scale. Yes, yeah. So this is what explains it. Okay. So what our study finds out from the hypothesis was that for people who actually did raise, we found out that though not statistically significant, people who raise funds were able to scale a bit better than people who did not raise funds, which goes to show that funding supports, although not to a large extent, funding supports the ability of a startup to be able to innovate and scale up better. So yes, the study did validate that it does. Thank you. No problem. Let's take question. Yes.
Thank you for the brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
There's a question I want to ask around improvisation.
Yeah. Bootstrapping. Yeah.
We know that regulatory intermediaries usually may have very strict rules to do in terms of organizing and rules.
Mm-hmm.
But I foresee potential friction between improvisation and regulatory authorities and intermediaries. So, how is there a study to see how startups can sidestep those frictions such that scale up is much more easier?
Yeah. Again, what we do think is that there needs to be a balance based on the kind of sector we are. The regulation is stronger in some sectors than some. So when we talk about the financial technology sector, where we've seen 68% of our respondents, and we've seen all the 4 unicorns, which has the highest amount of scale up, they have the highest amount of regulation. But here, when we talk about improvisation, not so much improvisation around their processes, but improvisation around how they build. So you find out that at times, people do not consider bootstrapping in terms of how they get talent, in terms of, for example, how some people, everybody wants to have a bogus office. Why are they not using incubators and accelerators and co-working spaces? Some people want to, as CEOs, even in terms of wage and compensation, rather than giving people stock options when you are just starting, you find that people are trying to employ people and pay top dollar. So it is those kind of improvisation and making do with what you have and resource constraint, or even at times in terms of logistics. Why do you want to own all the infrastructure when you can co-own and co-share hosting and all that? We think all of those things are what we mean by improvisation and not cutting corners in terms of regulatory. We do appreciate, thank you everybody for your time, and I do hope that this study, you'll find it useful to continue to build and iterate on all your businesses. Thank you for your time, and do enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Merci beaucoup. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate. Please